Damaged Defenders by Shares Up. Chapter 118. Thargeen and Tony. Part 3. For a people who had long since adapted to living without a sun, save those few folks who farmed or fished on the surface, walking into sunlight streaming into a room never stopped being very, very strange. It was far from the first time Thargeen had experienced the phenomenon, as he had, along with his other siblings, joined his parents on their trips to the other realms, both for business and pleasure. Still, Thargeen would never get used to it. In this case, it really didn't help that he'd only had a few hours nap before being so wakened. Looking at the window, though, was interesting. Their scans, as they'd approached, had told them a bit about Midgard, and seeing the city, if briefly lit up at night, had been quite the thing. However, it wasn't until now that it became clear, even from this height, just how many people were in this one city alone. Yes, Stark had told them roughly how many people lived on Midgard, but it was nigh on to impossible for Thargeen to conceptualize such a thing. 7 billion! Insofar as he knew, none of the other realms had ever had a population of even 2 billion! And such a number had predated each realm's golden age. Since then, none of the other realms had managed a population of even 3/4 of a billion. Seeing the traffic below, both on foot and the various vehicles, made such a ridiculous, mind-boggling number more real and concrete. Razin and Kimpana woke shortly after Thargeen did, and the three of them headed back to what was evidently the main social floor for the so-called Avengers and their associates. The rest of the day was very educational. Thargeen's early thought that Midgardians were essentially magicless dwarves was borne out again and again. Crafting things seemed to be a realm-wide activity. More, Midgardians had come up with some truly ingenious ways to do things that other realms used magic to accomplish, or especially in Nidavaldyr's case, didn't bother accomplishing. They ever seemed to be obsessed with learning and recording all they learned if their internet was anything to go by. It wasn't sapient, Jarvis aside, and interactive the way Svartalfheim's heart was, but it was definitely a repository of most of Midgard's information. This they discovered when Stark sat them down and showed them images and information regarding hydroponics, in preparation for the visit to an actual hydroponics farm. There were thousands of images at the least, and dozens, again at the least, of sites that either explained what hydroponics was or talked about some place that employed it and how. And there did seem to be quite a few methods just going by the images. I've got a couple of farms we'll be going to show you some of what can be done, and so you can confer with experts on the process, Stark told them. Most of it you guys would be able to put together pretty quick on your own, regardless of which method you end up using, if you go with this for the trade. Mostly you're going to need help with the nutrient mix the plants get fed. Granted, the plants on Svartalfheim aren't the same as Earth plants, but the folks that do this for a living can definitely help you figure out what it is your plants need, and in what quantities. Thargeen nodded at that. The more he saw of hydroponics, the surer he was it would be what they asked for in trade for the ships. It was a pretty equitable trade. Both were things necessary for long-term survival, if for different reasons. Both required that the trader initially assist the tradee in the use of the trade item. More importantly, both items could, after that initial assistance, be used and adapted very long-term without further assistance. And Earth in general will be willing to throw in seeds for some of our plants, Stark told them. Not sure if you'd want that or even if they'd be viable on Svartalfheim, but it's an option that would expand your dietary choices without being dependent on off-realm trade if it works. Once the information about hydroponics had been shared, Stark had let them loose on the rest of the internet, though he had specifically pointed out something called Wikipedia as a site where the most information was gathered, along with a warning that because of that, they could conceivably spend weeks investigating all the information that had been gathered together there. They'd still gone and looked. It had taken only one page to understand what Stark meant. So much information and so many links to other Wikipedia pages that explained bits of knowledge, each with their own links in turn. Thargeen was pretty sure they could spend a week just coming to understand a single facet of Midgard. It had taken a real act of will an intervention by Campana, to turn away from that and focus on getting to know the people they'd be working with rather than delving into what Midgardians knew and could do. Having met a few of the Avengers on their trip to Svartalfheim, Thorgin concentrated on getting to know, at least a little, the ones he hadn't met until his arrival on Midgard, and watching how everyone interacted. It became very obvious, very quickly, that this group, thrown together in the face of adversity, though they may have been, had gelled remarkably quickly. Not just as a fighting unit either, but as a de facto family, complete with playful bickering. Interestingly, it quickly became clear that certain of the women ruled over the group. Most notably, Stark's mates, identified as Pepper Potts, who arrived around midday, and the woman identified as Darcy Lewis. The other women were definitely high on the boss ladder, but to Thorgin's eye were a lot more subtle about it. Given that most of the other realms tended to put their women in second place, as it were, this hierarchy pleased Thorgin. Even if it ended up not holding true for the rest of Midgard, it was pleasing to see here. Tony was hard put to not crack up laughing at the dwarves throughout that first day. They were as curious as the proverbial cat, for one thing. Watching them poke at and exclaim over pretty much everything was a hoot. That they didn't do so with clever, for an inferior species, overtones was just a bonus. Not that Tony had figured them for such an attitude, really, but he'd learned the hard way to not assume the best of people. Showing them the internet, though? That had been hilarious as hell. Campana had ended up almost literally having to drag Rastin and Thorgin away from the monitor after a couple hours of poking around. They spent the rest of the morning hanging out with the gang after that. At lunch, Tony wandered over to the three. "Come on, gonna give you the 5-cent tour of the place," Tony said. "There's more here than living spaces after all." That got all three of them traipsing after him. The first place Tony went was the Avengers' lab floor. He headed straight for his own lab. While the other 2 labs had machines in them, there really wasn't that much to see and poke at. His, on the other hand, oh yeah, definitely more a dwarf's speed. Besides, Tony had an ulterior motive showing them the place. He was looking to the future. Good relations with the elves simply wasn't going to happen. They turned their noses up at everyone else. There was no way they'd treat Urs and her people any differently than they treated everyone else. And while the other realms were all pretty friendly, well, the flat truth was Earth simply didn't have much in common with most of the residents of the other realms. There was little in the way of innovation, creation, and seeking of knowledge from what he'd seen. The dwarves, on the other hand, still seemed to have the drive to learn and discover and create that the others didn't seem to. Tony figured that if Earth was going to have a really good, really close relationship with any one of the realms, it'd be the dwarves. The quicker they started the process, the better, and Tony was not above using what he knew of dwarven culture to his advantage to help forge that good, close relationship. And from everything he'd been given to understand, letting a fellow dwarf poke around in your workspace was a big deal, second only to letting them in on how you made stuff. Probably because any dwarf worth their salt had a good shot at figuring out how you made stuff if they got a good look at your workplace. Besides, call this a bit of playful revenge for all the geeking out he'd done on Svartalfheim. Turnabout was so very fair play. "Welcome to my workshop, everybody," Tony said, waving a hand in a gesture that rode the line between grand and negligent. As was normal for him, there were about 7 projects in various stages of assembly or disassembly spread out over his worktops, along with tools, rags, coffee cups, and other odds and ends. The fabrication units in the back were busily working away. Arrowheads and shafts at the moment. Tony was making a hell of a stockpile of every kind of arrowhead Clint used, along with enough shafts to put them on. The fletching, and putting said fletching on the shafts, would come later. Especially the fletching. The shafts and heads could easily be stored in bins for months. Once the fletching was on the shafts, long-term storing in a bin just wasn't a possibility. Dummy barely let them get in the door before he rolled over, chirping curiosity the whole way. As he did with everyone that walked into the lab for the first time, he circled the 3 dwarves, reaching out to nudge at them as he went, before he parked between Tony and the dwarves. Which was something Dummy hadn't ever done before. Then again, Tony had never brought 3 new people in here at the same time before. Yeah, there'd been 3 or more people in here other than Tony before, quite often in the last month and a half or so especially, but they'd been introduced to the bots singly. And even then, Tony had gotten the distinct feeling that Dummy, at least, watched everyone who came into the lab like a hawk. That whole mess with Stain had definitely left its mark on everyone involved. Dummy and Jarvis had been hit a lot harder by the whole thing than Butterfingers and you, and Tony had been and remained completely okay with letting them do or giving them what they needed in order to make sure Tony was okay. Besides, with Dummy parked between them, the dwarves were afforded a better look than if Dummy had stopped beside him, facing forward as he usually did. "This is Dummy," Tony said, reaching up to pat Dummy's claw, then letting his hand slide down to the smooth metal cylinder of Dummy's arm. "Is one of the constructs I mentioned when I introduced Jarvis this morning." Tony gave Dummy another distinctly affectionate pat. "He's the first one I made. The others are..." Tony motioned towards the charging stations where both Butterfingers and you were currently parked, but watching the newcomers curiously. "Over there. Their names are Butterfingers and you." All three dwarves had looks on their faces like they couldn't decide whether the names were hilarious or not, and whether or not they could get away with laughing if they weren't. "Go ahead and laugh," Tony told them. "I was young when I made and named these three. Wasn't even an adult when I made Dummy, and just barely old enough to claim adulthood when I made the other two." And he had always had a perverse sense of humor. They didn't laugh, but they did break out in big amused grins. "Just how aware are they, compared to Jarvis?" "Not too much behind him," Tony admitted. "They have rudimentary personalities and can act and react to things outside of what they were originally programmed for. Dummy more so than the other two, though I think that's more a function of Dummy having been first, and thus there was a bunch of stuff going into him that didn't get put into the other two." That and there for a couple of years it had just been Dummy and Tony. With only a human to imitate and learn from, Dummy had gotten a little further than Butterfingers and you, who'd had each other to imitate and learn from, as well as Dummy and Tony. That said, if I put any of the three of them in a place or situation completely unlike anything else they'd ever encountered, they wouldn't be able to figure out what, if anything, they should do. Hell, even Dummy saving his life had come from the Tony needs something out of his reach, give it to him, bit of Dummy's programming. Though admittedly, Dummy's guard dog tendencies since that incident were all Dummy. There wasn't a scrap of programming for such a thing anywhere in Dummy's code. "May I touch?" Razdan asked. Tony was thoroughly pleased that Razdan was very clearly aiming that question at Dummy, not him. Dummy, despite not having a face, managed to succeed in giving Razdan a suspicious look before he turned to Tony. Tony kept his expression bland, with neither approval nor disapproval clear to be seen. Dummy eyed Tony for a long moment, then eyed Razdan again, before slowly extending his arm with a distinctly cautious air. "He seems distinctly flabby," Campana commented. "Yeah," Tony said. "He has reason to be. About a year and a half ago, I was nearly killed in the lab he and I were working in at the time." Okay, the bulk of the incident hadn't taken place in the lab, just the last few moments, but Tony refused to go into details about that mess. "He's been protected of me and leery of other people's ever since." "Such a thing would definitely disturb even a being with a far more limited understanding than this fellow seems to have," Razdan agreed. Sargine, who'd been busy eyeballing the lab in general rather than concentrating on Dummy, nodded his agreement. "Even the simplest of animals can and will rally to the defense of one of their own in the face of predation,"